All right, today we're going to break down a structural model for how self-esteem is built. We already did a video on what self-esteem is. I'll link that down in the show notes. But how do you actually build self-esteem? I looked for resources for this on a very long time, a few years ago, about 5 years ago, and I could not find what I was looking for. But today we're going to learn how it's built. I found some resources. I put some things together. I put some things into practice in my life, and I've had some success with some things. And those are the methods I'm going to share with you. But how is self-esteem built? It's not built through feelings. It's not built through affirmations. As tempting as those things are, and as meaningful as those things can be. But rather, self-esteem is built through consistent behavioral feedback. So today, what are we going to learn in this video? We're going to learn why most self-esteem models collapse under pressure, a little bit of academic and kind of philosophical debate around unconditional versus earned self-worth. Then we're going to look at this loop. It's like a 4-part loop that you can use to build internal self-trust based on some of those philosophical principles. This loop is constituted by promise, execution, auditing, and integration. So promise, execute, audit, integrate. And then how to scale that loop over time into a reliable internal structure that doesn't depend on mood or motivation. And if you've ever made a promise to yourself and then you ghosted that promise, you've already felt that kind of fracture inside of you. Doesn't matter how small the promise was, but what matters is the system that you're training underneath. So self-esteem is not a feeling. It's an internal record of executed trust. The evidence that when you say you'll do something, you'll follow through. Not sometimes, not when the vibe is right, but consistently across emotional states, across days. This isn't about hyping yourself up. It's not about visualization. It's not about meditation. It's not about believing in yourself harder, like flexing that muscle. Just believe in yourself, right? That what about Bob moment. It's about building proof. And the way you do that is through this loop. Promise, execute, audit, integrate. So this loop is really how you construct behavioral self-trust. It's the basis of real self-esteem. So it's actually very helpful for us to understand some contrasting, conflicting views about really unconditional self-love versus conditioned self-esteem, how these concepts are different and how they compete. So to frame this conversation accurately, we need to acknowledge a long-standing tension in psychology and philosophy, which is, should self-esteem be contingent on behavior and competence, or is it an intrinsic right? And this debate has played out across decades of academic literature, right? Psychologist Nathaniel Branden, who popularized a structured view of self-esteem in the late 20th century, argued that self-esteem is a function of 2 core variables. And we've discussed this in our What is Self-Esteem video, but I'm just going to reiterate them here, right? So self-esteem is made up of 2 basic constituent parts: self-efficacy and self-respect. Self-efficacy is a conviction that is a trust in oneself, and self-respect is a conviction in one's right to be happy and right to belong in this world. And he considered both of these things earned. In contrast, humanistic psychologists like Carl Rogers emphasize unconditional positive self-regard, right? This idea that worthiness is not based on action, but inherent to the self. And in developmental and educational psychology, this split between Branden and Rogers it became really especially visible in like the 1980s through the 2000s. Critics of unconditional self-esteem argued that it created narcissistic tendencies and entitlement. Psychologists like Roy Baumeister and defenders of it really claimed that unconditional self-regard prevented shame-based psychopathology and it improved emotional resilience, right? So this results in this kind of philosophical fork. One view says self-worth is unconditional, you are worthy because you exist. And the other says self-worth is earned, through congruent action and self-honesty. The former, right, this unconditional positive self-regard, can soothe shame in acute moments. But as a system for long-term self-respect, it can create this dangerous bypass where if you repeatedly just affirm your worth while violating your own standards, you erode trust in your internal feedback system. And the model I'm offering here, this promise, execute, audit, integrate, is really more built on Branden's structural model. And it doesn't reject the value of self-compassion, but it positions self-esteem not as a feeling to protect, but as a signal to reinforce through behavior and clarity. Partially, this is really just about achieving semantic clarity and justification for this concept of self-esteem, which stands on its own and requires its own independent semantic domain. So, now that we have this context of unconditional self-regard, and unconditional positive self-regard from the Carl Rogers School, and kind of earned self-esteem defined as the combination of self-efficacy and self-respect, which are earned, right? I want to get to this question of why most advice fails on this, right? Most popular advice really skips the hard parts, right? They get to mindset tricks and vision boards and motivational speeches about self-esteem. And these aren't useless. Sometimes they can be the starter in the engine that ignites your willingness to act and can provide the kind of evidence that turns into self-esteem. So they're not really useless, right? But they do skip these two critical stages, which is auditing and integration. So I want to move into that in a moment. But when you fail, it feels like self-betrayal. And when you succeed, it doesn't feel real because there's no framework to recognize and to embed it. So you're just flying blind. There's no system, just guesswork and guilt, right? So here we're going to go into the 4-part loop to really give you a system for developing self-esteem that's not just advice, right? So if unconditional self-love can't reliably hold under pressure, what can? That's where this behavioral loop comes in. This model I use is behavioral, not emotional. So it's influenced by Nathaniel Branden's core claim that self-esteem is not a gift or a mood, but a consequence of action taken in alignment with values and with reality. And again, that loop is simple: that promise, execute, audit, integrate. This is not a motivational sequence. It's a regulation, a self-regulation architecture. And it's one that respects the need for internal credibility, earned, reinforced, and continuously recalibrated. So let's start with the first step, promise, where we make a small, concrete, measurable commitment, not a vague intention, right? Like a SMART goal style promise, right? So I'm going to write, so here's an example. I'm going to write 200 words. I'm going to lift weights for 25 minutes. I'm going to not look at my phone before noon, right? The key here is scope, right? It must be sized to survive emotional volatility, right? The point is not intensity, it is coherence. So we make a promise. The next is execute. So you act on that promise regardless of mood. This is where you demonstrate what Branden calls self-efficacy, the belief in your own ability to manage life's demands. Don't wait to feel aligned. You build proof by acting anyway. The third step is audit. This is really like the philosophical hinge of self-esteem. You reflect without shame. You check reality without distortion. Did I follow through? If not, what happened? Was my plan honest? Was it designed to work under the real world pressure? Right? This stage, it guards against self-deception, which Branden identified as really the silent destroyer of self-esteem. So you've got promise, execute, audit, and then we move on to integrate. Integrate. Now you embed what the loop revealed. You don't celebrate blindly or punish failure. You take the signal, good or bad, and then you refactor the system. You adjust the scope, you remove friction, you reinforce what held. This is how self-respect builds. Remember, self-esteem is self-efficacy and self-respect. The integration is how self-respect builds, not by achievement per se, but by the honest integration of your own data. Even if you failed, that can still be a source of self-efficacy and self-respect if you did not evade that failure and you owned up to it and you looked at it directly and said, I failed. I'm going to integrate the lessons from that into my life. That will build self-efficacy and self-respect, even if you fail. You can build self-esteem through failure after failure, right? And when you repeat this loop over time, promise, execute, audit, integrate, you stop trying to feel worthy. And self-esteem, you realize it doesn't even really offer that exactly. You just become someone you trust, right? So let's take a simple example. This is the first example we used earlier, right? So I'm going to write 200 words before noon. Let's say you're trying to start a practice of writing. I'm going to write 200 words before noon. So you execute or you don't. And then you audit. I did 120 words and then I spiraled. I opened my Word doc, but then I got on Twitter instead, right? I finished 200 words and I still had energy. Boom, right? Like all these possibilities could come to pass. And then now you integrate. Next time I'm going to block social media, right? Or I'll lower the bar from 200 to 150, right? Or I'll do it earlier, right? And that's the loop. It's behavioral. And eventually something will hook, but it's not emotional. And every cycle strengthens that core signal. I can trust myself. So real quick, I just want to note, I want to make a comment on this audit stage, okay? Why is this audit stage so non-negotiable? When you skip the audit, success feels like luck. When you skip the audit, success feels like luck. You can't explain it. You don't know what worked. You don't know what didn't. Worse than that, failure feels like an identity collapse. You missed a target, and now the whole self-trust structure feels brittle, right? Audit breaks that pattern. It lets you collect feedback without collapsing because it's not about perfection. It's about wiring the loop. And so then, how do you scale the loop, right? Once you trust the loop, promise, execute, audit, integrate, you can scale it, right? Daily promises become weekly focus loops, right? Weekly audits become monthly recalibrations. Over time, the system becomes structural to your identity design. You don't think about esteem. You just run your loop. And each layer builds on the last. You accumulate behavioral proof. You compound clarity. And eventually you stop asking if you're enough because you have the receipts. Self-esteem isn't built by thinking. It's built by running these loops and integrating what they teach you. So what did we learn today? We moved beyond surface level self-esteem advice and defined it structurally as the cumulative result of consistent action and reality checking and integration. We also saw why common mindset strategies fail and how that behavioral loop, that promise, execute, audit, integrate, gives you a repeatable structure for building self-trust. We also saw where Nathaniel Branden's theory fits in to other theories and how earned self-esteem differs from this popular idea of unconditional positive self-regard from Carl Rogers. And then most importantly, you now have a system that you can apply immediately, one that respects your agency and reinforces your integrity through action.